Feminism. It's never been more actively marketed in the mainstream than it is today. Feminism has come to be known as inextricably linked with the fight for gender equality in the modern world. Right from its earliest wave in the late 19th century, to the fourth and fifth waves that we witness in this day and age, feminism has evolved immensely. Kicking off as a campaign for women's voting rights, it has progressed to become an ideology, a social identity, and a set of institutions fighting for female emancipation and freedom. Feminism has spread far across the globe. Its ideals and values have been adopted and embraced by women of different cultures and faiths. There's no denying that movements that identify as feminist have made significant contribution to women's social, political, and economic privilege, bringing to light many injustices and cases of abuse in the private and public realm.
We're all here because we care deeply about the well-being of women, and we want to promote a safe and productive environment for women. That means equal pay for equal work.
But modern feminism has also sparked a great deal of controversy. Its goals and intentions have been questioned by conservative groups. Many communities have undermined its methodology, arguing that its goals threaten the traditional family and are at odds with physical reality. Undoubtedly, the notion of justice between the two genders is regarded by most people as a universal ethical standard that's worth fighting for. But what this justice truly looks like in practice is a point of contention and debate. What constitutes a basic human right for women? And at what point does feminism begin to undermine its own principles, as critics suggest? This documentary explores modern feminism, its contributions to, as well as the challenges it has presented for society.
The word feminism was coined by the French thinker Charles Fourier in 1837, and by it he understood a broad, all-encompassing idea that affords both genders, men and women, their rights, but specifically an attempt to offer women the political, economic, social rights at a time when many people felt women were being excluded and treated less human, and in many cases demonized and undermined and excluded from participating fully in mainstream society.
Western feminism traces its origins right back to the 15th century. One of the earliest feminist writers, Christine de Pizan, authored the Book of the City of Ladies, which protested misogyny and the role of women in the Middle Ages. But progressive ideas about the position of women in society really arose in the Enlightenment period, when a number of female philosophers, such as Margaret Cavendish and Mary Wollstonecraft, argued vigorously for greater equality for women. It was believed that patriarchal attitudes were rooted in classical philosophy and early interpretations of religious texts. Theories that were devised by traditional philosophers like Plato, Hippocrates, and Aristotle were accused of being sexist and making misogynistic assumptions about women.
If we answer the question, what is patriarchy, historically, we get a very strange answer indeed, because for most of Western civilization, patriarchy hasn't existed. Because patriarchy is a very recent term which has been invented to try and understand power structures, and particularly power structures between men and women. Understanding the power structures between men and women is something that's only really become pressingly important since the Industrial Revolution, and above all, since medicine changed, and more particularly since birth control started. Before birth control, before some of the changes in medicine, most people were simply trying to survive, have children, survive economically, and so depending on where you were and what part you played in the social structure, there was a sort of collegiality between men and women. People had different roles, but essentially you might say either the family or the community was made up of men and women, and they relied on each other in a role of mutual dependence, with different roles. That changed particularly after the First World War, when, as capitalism developed, women had to take over men's work because the men weren't there, they were away fighting. What you then had was women quite rightly saying, we want more legal protection in society. So I think there are three stages. There's potency, where where both men and women are potent in a relationship. Sometimes men are more potent, women are more potent. Then there's rights, and then there's power.
If I had to trace the origins of feminism to something, I would probably look at the emergence of empire, of colonialism, of industrialization, because I think that what you have at that point is a change in the relative importance of the private realm, where women were dominant, and the public realm, where men were dominant. So up to that point, the private realm was really, I think, probably the heart of people's lives. Home and family was more important than what happened out there. But when you had processes of industrialization and so forth, the public realm, particularly for the more privileged members of society, became much more important. And this was the point at which women who felt that they were more restricted to the private realm may have felt that they were missing out on something and may have wanted to have a piece of that cake.
The defining point in the history of feminism, what's classed as its first wave, began in the mid-19th and early 20th century with the women's suffrage movement. This movement was the first of its kind to campaign for the political and economic rights of women, with particular focus on voting rights, education rights, and the right to own property.
Human rights were essentially the target for first wave feminism, where women wanted, first of all, to have property. The Married Women's Property Act was an enormous change in England. And then rights to vote. And after that came the question of pursuing equality of function. But equality of function can only really take place within capitalism, because capitalism treats people as units. It doesn't care whether they're men or women. It's just interested in their productivity. So the great dilemma for women was, in order to gain more rights, in order to gain more power, we're going to need to become like men. And you know, the big question in our culture is, can women have it all? Can they both bear children and be mothers and grandmothers, as well as being company directors and earning the same amount as men?
What I think perhaps triggered the emergence of feminism was a change in emphasis where the public realm became more important. And I think that in many societies where you still have a more important private realm, feminism just doesn't really catch on.
So after that big milestone was achieved, there was a bit of a lull, really, until we got to the 1960s. And with all the social changes that were taking place then and what became known as the sexual revolution, there was suddenly an upsurge and what became defined at the time as the second wave of feminism. And this had a much more socio-cultural focus.
Second wave feminism's most significant victories included winning women the right to train for and gain entry into all career paths, including traditionally male-dominated occupations, from construction and coal mining to law and engineering. They drew attention to women's unpaid work within the household and demanded equal pay to men in the workplace.
There was lots of other de facto inequalities identified, and it was concerned with things like, sexuality and marriage and the family, as well as things like the workplace and other aspects of cultural life.
This second wave of feminism became the largest and longest lasting of all movements of the New Left, with an unbroken trajectory that stretches into the 21st century. It also aroused the most opposition, even among women themselves.
Prior to feminism, the assumption was that there were slightly different roles. Men were more providing for the family, and while women provided for the family too, they probably did slightly more nurturing, slightly more direct care. So men and women had different roles, and this created an interdependence. And interdependence is the basis of cooperation. But what the feminists did was create one model, which was this sort of radical individualism model. And this is what, so you have your married couple and they're both doing the same thing. And then the woman is saying, well, how come my husband is earning more than me? And how come he's not doing as much work as me? And suddenly, housework as me, for example. And suddenly what you have instead is a model of competition, which now enters the marriage and the family and the domestic realm.
Rights and protections were crucial for working class women to ensure that they weren't being exploited in the workplace. But liberal feminists, who became the most influential fragment of the second wave, started to romanticize the happenings of the public sphere. Gradually, social attitudes were changing. Working outside the home was now much more appealing to all women, and those who did not began to feel left out. The role of women was no longer seen as restricted to the home. The wealthiest families in society had the privilege of employing maids from lower-class backgrounds to take up most of the housework, while their focus had shifted to the public sphere.
The role model feminists gave to women was what they saw men doing. They didn't take the female role, they took the male role, but also what they did was they took the male role as they understood it.
So sisterhood was the great rallying cry of the second wave feminists. They were really rallying against what they saw as the characterization of women and what they had to be by a male-dominated patriarchal culture.
They understood that men were just after careers, and that men were after status, and that men were after power, and this is why men were dominant in the public realm, and they created this as a model for women. And I think this was misleading because, first of all, they attached no importance or value to caring for your family, caring for children, caring for your relatives, which actually is really important for a lot of women. And also it misunderstood men. Because the reason why the majority of men went to work every day and did boring, tedious, hard, work, because let's face it, that's what it is, was because they needed to provide for their families. Men were not these radically autonomous beings. They had actually been sort of trained into providing for their families, and that's why they were doing what they were doing. Whereas feminists sort of created this model of this totally individualistic, self-centered person and said, women, this is what you should be.
Second wave feminists were accused of being essentialists in terms of they were really defining what was essentially woman and womanhood, but they were doing that in relation to men. So even if a band of feminists got together and sort of defined this is what sisterhood feminism is all about, there were other critics, feminists, who argued that, well, you're still doing that in relation to men. Women are still being seen as the other.
What feminism did was create a structure which actually put enormous pressure on all women to enter the workplace. And this is what we see today. Many women would like to be able to spend more time at home with their families, but they're actually under pressure to go out to work, because once a small number of women are raising the bar by having, dual incomes, contributing to, mortgages, etc., it raises the bar for everyone, and everybody has to go to the workplace.
It's almost playing into the hands of what used to be regarded as patriarchal attitudes. The whole structure that feminism was kicking against right from its early days was men telling women what they should think, what they should do, men denying women a voice. And yet within feminism, I'm seeing exactly the same patterns of behaviour. We want women to have a voice, but only if you keep to the script. There is a narrative and you will keep to the narrative. We want you to have freedom of thought, but please think the right things.
One of the sort of mantras of feminism is that it gave women choice. But there are two ways of looking at it. One is, quite honestly, I think that choices are restricted. Women are simply going out there and working because they have to. They're not having, the majority are not having hugely exciting careers and so on and so forth. But the whole idea of the male provider was seen as really inimical to female independence. And the feminist solution to this, and I mean this is quoted, was that the state should provide for families instead of men. And they actually created systems to do this. And to this day, if you look at the way benefits are distributed and taxes are done, there is still incentives for women to go it alone. There are certain, economic groups who will be better off without men.
We've got 5,000 men laid off as a result of this now.
Yes.
Does this not worry you?
Of course it worries me, but we've all got that responsibility. But if we always study the men, we'll never get anywhere.
Alongside citizenship rights and working rights, sexual freedom became a focal point for second-wave feminists. The women's movement and developments in contraception sparked changes in society's attitudes towards women's sexuality.
Sexual liberation, it's very much associated with the 1960s, free love, the beginning of the permissive society. You had the huge baby boomer generation after the war who challenged the traditional understanding of sexuality, that sex was for within marriage in a heterosexual environment, and it coincided with the beginnings of the pill becoming available, and modern methods of contraception certainly fueled that. And it sort of spanned the 60s to the 80s in terms of that very radical change. Huge increases in out-of-wedlock marriages, cohabitation, much higher divorce rates, and of course the easing of many divorce laws as well. And then on the back of that, LGBT and gay rights, and eventually same-sex marriage. So you can see almost a series of dominoes, if you like, or signposts. And almost unquestioningly, we assume that this was the best thing that ever happened to women. But pretty much all the negative consequences of sexual liberation hurt women, or disproportionately hurt women.
The movement to liberate women from the constraints of sexual conservatism changed the perception of marriage in Western society. The idea that you had to be shackled to a single partner for the rest of your life, till death do you apart, became a lot less desirable with the newfound freedom that both men and women were now able to enjoy. Among the many consequences of sexual liberation was the upsurge of women demanding abortions. For so long, women who wanted to terminate their unwanted pregnancies had to hide from the state and undergo risky procedures by backstreet abortionists. The increase in demand, along with the health risks faced by scores of women who underwent these procedures, led to feminist activists rallying for the legalization of abortion. This campaign came to be known as pro-choice, in support of the choice of women to do what they want with their bodies. Finally, in 1967, abortions carried out by registered practitioners were successfully made legal under the Abortion Act.
What feminists have also done is completely downplayed women's role as mothers, women's role as givers of life, women's sacrificial role for the family. They've completely downplayed all those things which I think earned women huge amounts of respect in traditional society.
One of the things that feminism has done is to spawn an enormous abortion industry. And feminism would say, well, this is because the rights of a woman over her own body are entirely sacrosanct. Many Muslims and Christians would say, actually, no, the child you're bearing has its own rights. In fact, it has more rights than most people because it needs more rights, more vulnerable. So the problem for feminism is to know how it's going to build a society if it insists that having children is an infringement or an endangerment of the potential of a woman and a mother. And the prospects of creating a society 1 and 2 generations down the road are somehow curtailed or diminished. I think it's as practical as that.
If you look at my other area of research at the moment is sex education. I write and speak on that quite a lot. And if you look at it, it's focused on downplaying the role of reproduction all through, from the age of 4 upwards. They want to ignore reproduction, and when they mention it later in teenagehood, they put STD, pregnancy. Pregnancy is reduced to a sexually transmitted disease.
Abortion tends to be sold as though it was some kind of a product. If you look at the literature that's put out by abortion facilities, it's it's almost funny the way they phrase things in such a euphemistic way. They talk about a gentle suction will remove the fetus, the contents of the uterus, the pregnancy tissue. The dial-a-pam works by gently opening the cervix. And one thing I point out in lectures is I have never heard the word gentle used like that in any other medical literature. You know, if you get literature about having your tooth pulled out, it's pretty unpleasant reading, but you need to know what you're consenting to. If it's unpleasant, if it's going to hurt, you need to know it's going to hurt. And yet with abortion, everything about the way it's described by abortion facilities is aimed at making sure the woman goes through with it. And in so many cases, when I talk to women who regret their abortions, that was the problem. They'll say, if someone had told me how advanced the baby was, if I'd been allowed to look at an ultrasound scan and seen just how big the baby was, how developed it was, I wouldn't have gone through with it. If I'd been told I'd feel so terrible afterwards, that I'd grieve for my baby for years after the event, I wouldn't have gone through with it. You can't talk about choice if you're not giving informed choice. It's a way of treating women like little children who have to be protected from the truth. That's not the way it should be. You know, it's about honesty. And if we can't be honest with women, then what's the point of all of this?
By destroying, and that's been quite systematic, they've really played down our whole reproductive role, because that was seen as a challenge to our sort of the whole emphasis on career. And I think that leaves us, you know, in a way that reduces us more, in a way, to sex objects. You know, it's like, well, so what are we about now? We're attractive, glamorous beings, and I think so. Even in that respect, I feel that feminism has truncated womanhood in a way which has enabled pornography to have a more destructive influence than it would otherwise have done.
We talk about pornography now as the new drug. It's endemic. It's being consumed on a huge scale from boys as young as 11. Now, at least part of that is because of technical advances with the internet. These things can be streamed into people's homes. In the old days, you know, you'd have to go to a dodgy shop and get a magazine or whatever. So on one level, it's because it's just easier to access. But pornography is so exploitative of women on every level. It turns women into objects on which men can reenact and play out their sexual fantasies. It's extremely damaging to the women who actually participate in porn. The suicide rate, the drug overdose rate is huge, but it also has a huge impact on the way men perceive women. Because, of course, if you're constantly watching very violent images of sex and images of women being debased and humiliated, that is going to have some impact on the way you see women in your daily life. So it's hugely detrimental to women, it's detrimental to relationships.
The ease of access to porn has enabled a high rate of porn addiction and has made treatment for addiction a great challenge. The average age of first exposure to porn is now only 11 years old. As many as over 90% of boys and over 60% of girls first see porn before they turn 18.
Even when we're not talking about overt pornography, the more general objectification of women within society is so commonplace. If you look on the television, images of impossibly sexy, beautiful, svelte women just are all over, advertising all over the media, and girls are being bombarded with these images all the time. It's very difficult as a parent to say to a girl, you are valuable because of who you are, you know, get an education, go and change the world, when all they're being told is, no, you just have to be slim and sexy and wear a bikini. And all that matters is that men want you all the time.
Let's look at the fruits of modern feminism in practice. So, you know, first of all, the idea that, you know, marriage and the natural family is an institution of oppression, of patriarchy. Marriage is no longer the norm in our society. It's no longer seen as the thing to do, quite the opposite. So in Britain, only half of the adult population are now married, and the research shows that that's actually made people more lonely and more depressed. A massive proportion of the adult population are using antidepressants. Of that half the population that do get married, 40% of those marriages end in divorce, and that has very serious consequences. Family breakdown, particularly on children. But marriage is it's still more beneficial than cohabitation. So, for instance, parents who are married are 3 times more likely to still be together by the time their child is 5 years old than if their parents were just cohabiting. And the children of married parents and all the research shows are far more likely to do better educationally. They're about 23% more likely to go to university and have far better life and career prospects. They're less likely to be involved in crime or have mental health issues, and every single indicator of social research shows the overwhelming benefits of marriage and the natural family.
While previously marriage was considered the norm, a social responsibility for every individual, both men and women were increasingly seeing it as merely an option. More children were now being born outside of wedlock, and this trajectory has persisted to this day.
So the fact that half of the children born in the UK are born out of wedlock means that millions of children, half of those born today, are being born into a situation of distinct disadvantage, and a quarter of the children today are actually brought up in a home where their biological father is not living with them. Now, the whole idea that children need a mother and father, a parent of both sex, is very much derided today as just an outmoded concept.
I think it's a pretense that women can go out and have sex, with sort of random people they don't really know, have these early sexual relationships. I think this is actually quite soul-destroying for women, and I think we really need to get in touch with our own sexuality. Us women, we don't work like that, and I know women who hear me say this will say, yeah, I go out and sleep with people, I'm absolutely fine. Well, maybe you are now. Maybe. How are you going to feel further down the line? And how many sides of your personality have you had to shut down in order to be comfortable with sleeping with someone and never seeing them again? I'm sorry, I just don't believe that's the way that human beings were supposed to be.
When it comes to examining feminism and its relationship with faith in the world today, attitudes towards notions such as sexuality and liberation are among the most heated areas of discussion. How do Christian and Muslim attitudes towards sexuality clash with secular feminism? And what does it truly mean to be free as a woman?
Ever since the medieval period, Europeans have been infatuated with Muslim women, specifically the veil. And for them, most criticisms directed at Muslims have often revolved or had some relevance to the veil. We find this in European paintings, in European literature, in European texts, be it theology or legal texts. And the idea is women are coerced, forced, oppressed individuals who lack an agency, and them being forced to cover up or wear a hijab is an instance, we are told, of their oppression. That is no longer the case, particularly as we come across third and fourth wave feminism.
I don't think hijab would restrict women's intelligence and movement and activities and contributions. It would never. It would never. Hijab is to protect. Hijab is to encourage. Hijab is to push forward. It's not to suffocate, not to imprison, not to retain them, not to restrain them from activities. The idea of hijab is that don't look at her as a physical object. Respect her brain, her intelligence, her contribution, her hard working. Don't grade her according to how she looks.
The issue of choice is paramount. So if a woman is forced to do one thing, take it off or put it on, that's a problem for me. And most feminists would say the same thing. But I think it can, in instances where it is a liberator, in which you move into a society down the street where your sexuality and your body are under the gaze of men who use it in oppressive and unjust ways, it can be a very empowering tool. But also equally, if you are forced to wear it because you are seen as awra, for example, or the fact that your presence in a particular space makes it suddenly haram, I think that's not helpful.
Femin is a controversial group of feminists known for their topless protests across much of Western Europe and even parts of the Middle East. It's a movement that claims to be taking back and politicizing women's sexuality. Their naked bodies symbolize hatred for patriarchy. The leader of Femin herself describes them as the naked shock troops of feminism. One of its major aims has been to protest against the Islamic veil, denouncing it as a tool of oppression against Muslim women. But while the topless protests are supposed to represent so-called freedom of expression, one can't help but wonder how such a public display of nudity truly goes far in achieving anything other than reducing females down to their bodies once more. While in contrast, the hijab is a direct stand against the hypersexualization of the female gender that is so prevalent across the media in both the West and the Eastern world.
In many ways, I think we've taken a few steps back in terms of the way we value women and the way we portray women within society. There was a time when if a man leered at a woman, it was kind of regarded as a bit off. You certainly wouldn't admit to it as a bloke. Whereas now, sort of lust and leering is almost something we take as a kind of joke, or regard almost as a healthy thing. If a man's interested in a woman, and yet at the same time, we have the Me Too movement and an awareness that actually harassment is a terrible thing. But you can't talk about the Me Too movement and you can't talk about harassment without looking at everything that's fueling it.
The sexual harassment allegations against Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein sparked an online movement in which women wrote Me Too on social media platforms, highlighting just how pervasive the issue of harassment is. It was inspired by actress Alyssa Milano's call to action, and celebrities from Reese Witherspoon to Olympian Michaela Maroney all shared their personal stories of their own experiences with sexual harassment.
I think with the Me Too movement, it has been in many ways a very positive movement in that it has called out harassment in the workplace, certainly in Hollywood and in the media, and it has allowed women space to talk about their experiences and also to draw people's attention to how commonplace it is, how frequently women have to cope with some level of harassment as they go about their daily lives. If you like, it's a chance for the female experience perhaps to be talked about more honestly. However, the very same industry that is promoting Me Too and is claiming that it's really concerned about harassment is also the same industry that's pumping out material saying that it's all about harassment, that women are just sex objects. So it's almost as if we can't admit when we are the problem. We look at it as something, an unfortunate hangover perhaps of a past age that we just have to get rid of. We don't look at how we feed the problem. These issues just don't appear out of nowhere. And I'm not saying that things have not improved in terms of female safety, but I just feel we're still failing to grasp the nettle. We're not looking at the way we are contributing to the problems of society.
The perceived failures of second-wave feminism sparked a new wave in the 1990s that were aimed at challenging traditional views on femininity. It adopted what's described as an intersectional outlook. What it meant to be male or female was no longer seen as fixed, but was largely dependent on one's ethnicity, class, and religion. Third-wave feminism embraced a more individualist approach, seeking to redefine what it meant to be a feminist. As the feminist scholar Elizabeth Evans sums this up when she said, "Confusions surrounding what constitutes third-wave feminism is in some aspects its defining feature. Third wave feminism took to the internet and gained popularity across the globe. Feminists were able to broaden their goals and began to focus on challenging traditional gender roles and stereotypes surrounding women in parts of the Eastern world.
Second wave feminists were very much seen as, white, middle-aged, middle-class women, really speaking for their own concerns and values. And what you got was sort of, black feminists or lesbian feminists saying, well, we see things a bit differently. So it all started to break down really later from about 1990 onwards came third wave feminism, what's also known as now as post-feminism. So rather than what's essentially woman and womanhood being seen as something that's biologically determined and gender comes out of that, then the whole idea of woman itself and two different sexes is now seen as something entirely ideological. So, in other words, femininity, womanhood is an entirely social construct. It's just all relational.
It's inconceivable that we can have flat equality, because that would suggest that everything is identical. You could only have equality if you have everything being identical, otherwise there are differences. But what postmodern feminism has done is essentially to make the change to say that reality is what you imagine it to be inside your head. This is one of the ways of escaping patriarchy or the structures other people impose on you. If your freedom to be or do what you want to be or do is constrained by other people's concepts or categories, well, imagine your own. You can be who you want to be. So it's a triumph of subjectivity over objectivity, a triumph of relativism over absolutism.
The seeds of the feminism that we see today were actually sown in the early forms of feminism. So what do I mean by this? For example, feminism, an article of faith, I would say literally, of feminism is that women were subordinated by men. Women were sort of subordinated in the private realm. They were subordinated and oppressed by men, and that there was patriarchy and that men were the oppressors. And this, in order to sustain this idea, you had to pretend that sex differences didn't exist. Because if you acknowledged that there were sex differences, then suddenly you had quite a rational explanation for why men and women were in different positions. And so from very early on, feminism had to deny sex differences. And although the word gender, I think it was first used by a man, John Money, it was actually feminism which hugely popularised this whole concept of gender and the whole concept of sex being a cultural construction. So, what the feminists are actually fighting against today, where we see sex differences denied and we see, men saying that they're women, this is actually a product of this early feminism.
With feminism adopting a more individualist approach, it is argued by conservative groups that it systematically downplays the significance of the nuclear family. Both Christians and Muslims are united in the idea that the traditional family, consisting of a mother, a father, and their children, forms the basic unit of society, and that emphasis on individual freedom leads to its disintegration and poses irreversible threat to both individuals and society at large.
The family is the lifeblood of society, and I think this set the seeds for the chaos we see around us. Once you destroy the family, then the culture is going to crumble.
As well as the human costs, just the financial cost of family breakdown, which has been estimated to cost the country around 51 billion a year. So this is really the cost and legacy of modern feminism. It's family and social breakdown. And those who suffer most out of that are usually the children.
The family provides us with a tremendous source of security and identity. And, you know, we're not afraid of the world when we've got strong families. But what we see happening in Western society is, you know, that the family gets reduced to a mother and her children. It gets fragmented and fractured, and so if this is the source of identity, when you break down the family, we need to search elsewhere for our identities. And I think this is especially happening among young people. You know, if your parents have split up, your identity is in crisis.
With Western feminism being actively promoted across the internet in the 21st century, it has gained unprecedented popularity, even in parts of the Eastern world, and has called attention to women's exploitation across the globe. But whether feminism truly offers a sufficient framework for women who come from various backgrounds that are largely unfamiliar to mainstream liberal feminists is a point worth reconsidering. A big complaint of feminism right from the start was that it was very white and middle class. And even to this day, feminist movements in the US and Western Europe have dominated the feminist discourse in a way which displaces non-Western cultural values. It is criticized as a form of colonization that codifies non-Western cultures as others. It has often presented a simplistic picture of what gender oppression looks like in the Eastern world, while overlooking the nuances surrounding the issue.
Right from the beginning, when the suffragettes famously had their banner, votes for women, some people used to joke it was votes for ladies, because it was actually very middle class. There weren't that many working class women involved in it. Of course, it was a different demographic at the time in Britain. And unfortunately, I still feel it's a little bit that way. There's a lot of tokenism. I remember very vividly, and it's one of those pictures that stuck in my mind, going to a student women's campaign meeting when I was at Cambridge, and they were talking about abortion and the way different cultures see it. There was a Muslim girl there, and she was obviously Muslim. She was in a hijab, and she addressed herself as coming from a Muslim background. And all these white, spiky-haired girls were explaining Islam and saying, well, because most Muslims probably think like us, actually. I mean, and we don't have a problem with Muslims because most of them, in fact, secretly have the same views as us. And they never asked the Muslim girl what she thought. She was just there as a kind of totem to prove that there were people from different ethnic groups in the organisation.
I think the problem with how Muslim women are viewed is that it's kind of done within a post-colonial and post 9/11 lens. So our voices are not our own. Our bodies and our culture and our religion are highly politicised. So there's this debate happening up here, and it's interested in knowing why there's terrorism, and that's about it. And there isn't any kind of nuance around that. So what happens is Muslim women, we just kind of get lumped into this. We must be oppressed because Muslims are terrorists, aren't they? And actually that's just such a simplistic way of looking at it. I think it's so important for people to recognise that Muslim women are incredibly powerful. And there's more to our narrative than just the hijab and how we look, because that's the other thing which I find really interesting. There's this obsession on how Muslim women look, which for me kind of reminds me of this obsession on how women look generally. Are we covered too much or too little? Let's move beyond that. Let's see beyond the image and try to get to the very heart of what Muslim women are.
Even the issues that feminism talks about so angrily do feel like very first world problems a lot of the time. It distresses me seeing in America since Trump the women dressed up as Handmaid's Tale. Have you seen the red dresses and the white bonnets? We have already created the world of the Handmaid's Tale, but in other countries, in India, for example, where you can buy yourself a surrogate, isn't that the Handmaid's Tale? You know, taking a woman who's stuck in the poverty trap to provide you with your baby because you can't have one and you want one. Isn't that the world of the Handmaid's Tale? Stop dressing up and pretending that that is your situation when actually it is somebody else's situation who you're not taking seriously.
Whether you call it the Middle East or the Islamic world, were under the reigns of colonialism and imperial hegemony until very recently. Now, many people ignore that, but allow me to give you an example. There is a law, for example, widespread in the Middle East, that a rapist must, by law, marry his victim, right? Many people have pinpointed that as an instance of Islam's degradation or dehumanization of women. Now, many people fail to recognize that the origin of that law goes back to French colonial rule in Tunisia and in Lebanon. It's no coincidence that the law, particularly in those two countries, in Tunisia and Lebanon, remains very strong. It's known as Article 308, for example, in Jordan or Tunisia. And this started when French colonial rule was imposed, a very masculine reading of gender was imposed on these two countries, and it was known as a gentleman's agreement, where the French occupiers or the French colonial masters told the locals in that region, we will provide you, we will allow you to exert your patriarchal masculinity in whatever way you want, providing you grant us access or freedom over your resources. So this was one instance when this rule, which by the way was still applicable in practice in France until the 1940s, was removed. So that we have to be very historically conscious of how things developed.
In recent years, feminist activists have often antagonized traditional religion, and particularly the Islamic faith, claiming that it endorses the restriction of women's freedom through not only the strict Islamic dress code, but also judicial laws when it comes to issues such as marriage, divorce, and inheritance. There have also been criticisms surrounding the traditional gender roles recommended within both the Christian and Muslim faiths. But to what extent are these criticisms valid?
Ever since the 13th century, and this is the time in history when Europe became quite intimately familiar with Islamic teachings because of exchanges between Muslim scholars and the Latin clergy in places such as Toledo and Sicily and Cordoba and elsewhere. There has been a concerted effort on the part of some European scholars to undermine the credentials of Islam.
We have three areas of thought. We have Christianity, Islam, and we have secularism, of which feminism is a part. And very often when people are discussing concepts, they don't understand the other two. There are very few people who are literate in secular philosophy, Islamic jurisprudence or spirituality, and Christian philosophy. But in particular, secularists don't understand Islam at all. In fact, they don't understand Christianity either. And so they tend to see both Islam and Christianity as deficient power structures, repressive structures where some men and most women are in different ways deprived of their autonomy or their rights or their capacity to flourish or to develop. I think one of the ways in which we invite them to think again is that not all human flourishing comes from having power. There are spiritualities in both Christianity and Islam which actually suggest that humility and vulnerability and love are human characteristics that bring you far more happiness and stability of mind and sanity than exercising power over other people. We could throw the question back to feminists and say, well, all you're interested in is manipulation, because most people use power to manipulate and control others. So which is better, manipulation or love? And Islam and Christianity would say, well, love is. So I think the answer is that we say to secularists and to feminists, you need to broaden your lexicon of your understanding of humanity. You need to look at human beings as more than just agencies of power, but you need to understand them as people in pursuit of love, hope, as well as justice, peace, forgiveness, and a vision of humanity that secularism loses the moment it begins to lose touch with its spiritual roots.
Scholars have demonstrated quite clearly and without any ambiguity that the overall message of the Quran is one of a trajectory that leads towards egalitarianism. Now, this is something that is to be noted, and people tend to ignore it quite often. The idea of equality, as we've inherited in Europe, most people assume we've inherited ideas such as equality and egalitarianism and what have you from the period of Enlightenment. And that is true. But very few people have actually explored the origins of notions such as equality. Where did Europe come to terms with ideas such as equality? Now, historians of thought have now shown that in Europe, for example, most of the early feminist advocates of feminism, such as Susanna Anthony and other Knott, for example, they inherited ideas of equality from Quaker theology, from Christian theology, where there's a clear Christian spiritual equality between the two genders. Likewise, of course, many people have often noted that the entire paradigm in the Quran is one that moves towards a very strong, clear-cut spiritual as well as a moral equality between the two genders. And there's a trajectory in the Quran. When you read a text, sometimes the text contains particulars, but the text also contains an overall message, a theme, so to speak, what scholars of philology or textual criticism call a leitmotif. Now, the leitmotif, the overarching theme of the Quran, is one that invites towards absolute equality. Take, for example, the moment humans are born, right? The Quran refers to that at an instance when the soul, we created it from a single soul. This instance of birth is not gendered. There's no reference to gender. And then you take it during human actions, when God says the most favorable amongst you is not gender A or gender B, it's the most pious. And then take it to the very last moment of death, when he says every soul shall taste death. So we have three of the most important, if you like, watershed moments in the history of humanity: birth, mainstream living, and death. In all three instances, the Quran addresses human beings using a very neutral term, the soul. Gender seems irrelevant.
I think feminism needs to open up. It needs to be confident enough to have an honest conversation. We should not be in a situation where women get shouted down when they're saying something unpopular. We should be able to have respectful debate and accept the fact that there will be huge differences of opinion on certain issues. I don't imagine there is any woman who doesn't want their daughters to succeed, who doesn't want a better world for women, who doesn't want equality. But we are never going to get there if we're constantly fighting amongst ourselves and we're constantly pushing a kind of non-negotiable image of womanhood that for millions of women around the world simply doesn't make sense.
Why does patriarchy still persist in the Middle East? That has to do much more with culture, with socio-economic and political considerations than religion. The Middle East is not one singular region. Again, to speak of Muslim women can also be very problematic. Muslim women come from different classes, different economic backgrounds, different ages, different persuasions, different religiosities. To speak of one singular oppressed Muslim woman is to fall into the colonial trap, and that is to reduce all Muslims to one singular label.
I think that we don't actually need feminism to fight for the rights of the most marginalised, neglected and abused women. I think that we should always be fighting for the well-being of the most marginalised, abused and neglected people. If you look at third world countries, very often the issue is that the women are doing a huge amount of the work, supporting the farm or the family or whatever, and the men are off perhaps because they had to migrate somewhere. And the emphasis of feminism is to increase the workload of women, when actually in a different cultural context it might be much better to work out how men can contribute and support their families. But feminism would never even think like that. So I don't see feminism as a way of addressing the most marginalised and abused people in society. Where we see suffering, we need to address it, regardless of whether it's male or female, with the caveat that where children are involved, we need to address it even more urgently, and that might lead to more attention on women.
My biggest bugbear when it comes to feminism is the very adversarial nature of it. And so much of it is always about what's wrong with men. Now, the new feminism, which has sort of emerged from the Catholic Church, but I'm seeing it in different areas now, talks about the complementarity of the sexes, that men and women should be working together as equals. What we can achieve when we work together, rather than assuming that we're enemies. That's the curse of ancient times. If we can work together, what sort of a world could we create?
One of the things we try and do is to find roles of complementarity for men and women. We start with what we're like. I mean, as it happens, men are are bigger and stronger physically, and women bear children. Feminism wants to say, well, men can be as nurturing to children as women can. Actually, most of us know they can't. They don't have the patience, they don't have the emotional imagination. There's something in our hard wiring which doesn't work, and that, of course, throws up a huge argument between nature and nurture that we disagree about. But I think one of the important things that both Islam and Christianity have to say to secularism is that you have too narrow a vocabulary of what it is to be a human being. And secularism has been around for 200 or 300 years. It's a child of the Enlightenment. It doesn't have very deep roots. It's really only reactive. It's a kind of Christian heresy, effectively, as all rationalism and atheism is. But I think both Christians and Muslims can say to secularism, look, we've been doing this for 2,000 years or 1,500 years. We have a perspective which we can offer. And we ourselves know there have been times when both religious traditions have been decadent and when both religious traditions have flourished. And one of the things we're entitled to say is, look, here, where we flourish, this is what we've done. We both have within our tradition examples of women who are wholly admirable and gifted and creative and generative. One of the things we both fail to do is to hold up our examples of admirable womanhood and say to feminism, look, here is an addition to your vocabulary, an extra paradigm to your worldview. You might at least want to consider this, because certainly we have women Muslims and women Christians who are deeply content in their femininity and in their spirituality. And just to write them off, I think is superficial, as so many secularists and feminists do.
Feminism is not a fixed concept, it's an evolving concept. I guess increasingly women who choose to employ faith as a source of support and empowerment and justice, the fight for justice and equality, can be described as faith feminists or faithful feminists or religious feminists, who kind of go back to their own religious texts to try and apply equality and principles of justice to their faith, and to say that their faith supports equality, whereas traditional feminists would just say, no, faith is a reason why we are oppressed as women, and it is used by men as a tool of oppression, so that faith needs to be removed from the public sphere.
In the Islamic law, we have two types of legislations. One of them is fixed, thabit, does not change. For instance, the 5 daily prayers being mandatory. Wherever you go, wherever you live, wherever you travel, it's 5 times a day. However, there are other types of laws that are flexible and mobile. They change according to the circumstances, according to the nature of the societies. Among these flexible laws are women's rights and women's privileges. So we look at the society. We cannot compare today's women in modern societies, industrial societies, with women 2,000 years ago who hardly left their homes.
Whether feminism can be reconciled with Islam shouldn't be the question, if by feminism we mean justice and equity. Women's rights can and does exist in the lines of the Quran, and many scholars have reinforced this sentiment. But today, modern feminism faces a measurement problem. Individual gains are what shape the goals of most feminist activity today. In seeking absolute equality between the two genders, feminism has downplayed the inherent differences between males and females. The goal of feminism has become sameness, above accepting and embracing the biological, psychological, and social differences between men and women, as is highlighted within both Christianity and Islam. Feminism also paints a picture of universal freedom that fails to account for the experiences of non-Western women. So can I be both a Muslim and a feminist? It seems to me feminism leaves a lot to be desired.